Hello, and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 64, Thursday, August 26th, 2021.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I'm joined, as always, by the Verna Felton to my Eleanor Audley, my lovely co-host, Emily.
Bibbidi bobbidi boo! Courtney and I have a new author interview for you today.
Yes, after wrapping up our Sinister Summer series featuring all 4 volumes of Tales from the Haunted Mansion, we're returning with a new author interview with a book that features a few ties to the Haunted Mansion, as well among many other connections within the Walt Disney Company. Joining us today is Spencer Wright, author of Voices Behind the Magic. Spencer is from Pennsylvania and serves as a freelance contributor for www.info.com. Voices Behind the Magic is his first publication with Theme Park Press, and we can't wait to go behind the magic of the text itself. Welcome, Spencer.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Spencer, we're looking forward to talking about Voices Behind the Magic, but first, let's learn more about you, the author behind the book. So please tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you love Disney. And you just got back from a trip, so how was it?
Yes, so I live in southeastern Pennsylvania. My first Walt Disney World trip was when I was 12, and I just got back from my annual August trip. It was fantastic as usual. They've been doing a great job with reopening slowly. So it's a lifelong love as well of the movies and the parks, as well as the history, especially maybe over the past about 6 or 7 years. So learning both about the parks, the movies, some of the people involved. So, starting about 3 or 4 years ago, I started to think maybe I should do something with this besides just reading and listening to things. I wanted to do something with it. So I looked at, different idea for a podcast, a blog, or a book. In particular, a lot of topics that really aren't talked about. So in my book, Voices Behind the Magic, I talked about people who contributed their voice to different characters. But there's also musicians. There's a lot of supporting characters. There's shorts. There's a whole world of things within the world of Disney that oftentimes don't get the attention that maybe they should.
Yeah, the world of Disney certainly is so vast, and I'd love to know what inspired you to write about voice actors specifically.
So as I started to think about, if I could go back in time, what person would you want to meet? What moment would you want to, be present during? Like over and over, it was, I would love to talk to Eleanor Audley, who voiced Lady Tremaine and Maleficent and Madame Leota in the Haunted Mansion, or, people like Phil Harris, who voiced Baloo and 2 other characters. It's a lot of people like this. That all had their own interesting story. And also by studying them, you learn a lot more about the era as a whole. As we get further away from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's important to learn more about what life was like during that time if you want to understand the history.
I thought something that was so cool reading your book, like you said, how more about the era, one of the connections I saw was just how much they all knew each other.
Yes.
Because they all worked at similar, this is when studios had contracts, so you were constantly running into the same stars because they were contracted and seeing the overlap, and it was great. We're going to talk about some of our favorites that we read about, but it was really cool that as I kept reading, I kept seeing like, oh, they know so-and-so and so-and-so, and they worked together at Disney on this movie, but they also worked together on these other films, and I like that you brought in a wider range of not just focusing on what they did with Disney, but just their overall contributions into Hollywood and the silver screen and even radio. You also talked a lot about radio, which is cool.
Yeah, old time radio was a world that I've, loved old Hollywood since I was a teenager, Hollywood of the 30s, 40s, early 50s. And old time radio was a world that I was familiar with a little bit, But I really got to learn, and that's where they really all know each other. And there might be an episode of a show where there's, 4 people with direct connections to Disney on that episode. So it's funny to listen to because you'll hear like the Haunted Mansion ghost host and like several other characters on a show. So it was interesting to constantly come across this again and again.
That's so cool. But going to the front of your book, you immediately tell readers in the foreword that The Voice Behind the Magic was written and published in 2020 during the beginning of this pandemic. What was it like for you to be writing during this time?
That was okay. It was a little challenging with the parks because I do, mention some things where you can find characters in the parks. So as I started to reread it, I talked about character meet and greets. So initially, about mid-2020, I kept a lot of stuff in because I think there was still a mindset that, things might reopen, go back to normal real soon. And then when it became evident it wasn't, it's like, I should put in some kind of disclaimer. So if I mention you can go and see this parade, well, there's not a parade. Or Disneyland wasn't even open by the time I had submitted the manuscript for publication. So I didn't want to say I don't say go see this in Disneyland when it's not open.
Right. Well, we're so glad that it has reopened, but I'd love to springboard off of your mention of publication. You are among a family of authors that we have had from Theme Park Press, and every publication process is unique to each author. So we'd love to hear about your experience.
Yeah, so the great thing about Theme Park Press, it's an independent publisher. So really anyone can submit a book idea. So I submitted a proposal and I had a couple of sample chapters. And I think that's really important to make sure, if you're approaching the publisher, you have the idea, you have sample chapters. By that point, I did have a list of people that I wanted to cover. And that was tricky narrowing it down. But by the time I, approached the publisher, Bob McLean at Theme Park Press, I was definitely ready to go in terms of the writing. The main work was also pre-screening everybody because a lot of these voice actors, it was just a job. So they went to work, they were immensely talented, but it might be hard to research. So especially since this is my first published book, I made sure to pick people, for the most part, where the research would be more straightforward. There were a few exceptions.
That was actually my next question for you was you cover 13 incredible voices in your book. How do you pick who you're going to talk about? How did you pick who would be featured in your chapters?
Yeah, so I had a list of about 40 people who I narrowed it down.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I narrowed it down to 13. I thought that was a solid number. I thought it would be a good length of a book. So like I said, I made sure they were people that covered different movies. I wanted to have some parks, different eras. So me in my last chapter is Angela Lansbury, who was still alive and as recently as last year was voicing things in the park. But also I go back to Cliff Edwards, who voiced in Pinocchio. So I cover all different eras. And then I made sure that, especially since this was my first time, doing an endeavor like this, I made sure they were people who I could research. So like, for example, Verna Felton, there's a fantastic biography of her. So I could use that to help learn more about her, or Cliff Edwards, a good bit has been written about. Just to make sure they're people that I know I can flesh out.
That's awesome that you started with 40, though. It makes me think you could set yourself up for at least a whole nother volume with more there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I figured if someone doesn't work out, then I have people who, because the one person almost didn't work out, I know is a favorite of the show. Yeah, but it was quite a list.
Who was the favorite?
So that's Eleanor Audley.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, and basically almost everything I found about her I put in the book, which is a shame because she's such a fascinating person. Like I can imagine she had quite a life and story with the kind of characters that she played.
Yeah, it was really interesting to learn more about these people because I feel like, I certainly recognize the names. Like you, I assume we grew up watching a lot of those movies and you start to recognize similar voices or seeing names in the opening credits. But we'd love to take some time to talk about a few of these voices as maybe a little preview. We obviously won't go through all of them because we want people to read your book and have that same experience that we did. But each of us picked someone that we wanted to talk about with you. So I have selected Eartha Kitt, and I picked her because I feel like there were a lot of those, as I was saying, more of the golden age of Disney that come to mind, like Eleanor, Verna Felton, Hans Conried. But Eartha is a more recent one, even more recent than Angela Lansbury, and I am a fan of Emperor's New Groove. I think it's a very underrated film, so she is just one that I was delighted to see in your book.
Yeah, and because that's actually one of my favorite movies.
Oh, good.
And Yzma is one of my favorite characters. Yeah, so that's partially how she was selected. Also, she did a massive amount of interviews on television and with newspapers, so it's great to get an idea of what she was like or what she said. She loved doing the role of Yzma. And, for those who don't know, The Emperor's New Groove initially was a movie called The Kingdom in the Sun. And it's confusing because sometimes the title is Kingdom of the Sun. And it was a movie that didn't quite work out and essentially was simplified to become The Emperor's New Groove. And she voiced Yzma all through that process. And she was, she was an actress. She did some voiceover work. She was a singer, especially in the 50s and 60s, but even into the 2000s, she still was a cabaret singer. She had a very glamorous, persona that I think was also just true to her life in general. So it's interesting to see how almost her role of Yzma is like a foil to that.
Yeah, I really liked when you mentioned that she also continued to voice Yzma in the television series, because I think that's not always common. I mean, certainly other voice actors have taken over for characters like Maleficent, whose original voice actors aren't living. But even sometimes with living actors, they're just so busy that they don't continue for what would maybe be considered a smaller role, like a television series. Like I think about Robin Williams as the genie. I don't believe he continued that for the Aladdin TV series, but she was like, as long as I'm alive, I'm going to be Yzma. And I really loved hearing that within your book.
And she's the only Yzma.
Yes, exactly.
Well, and it's interesting you bring up The Emperor's New School, the television show, because that's where Disney Plus came in as an extremely helpful tool. Because Disney Plus, the streaming service, was released as I was working on this book. And The Emperor's New School, at least as far as I could find, wasn't released on any kind of media. So as I went along, I was like, I don't know if I can cover her if I don't, can't watch this television series. And luckily it was on Disney Plus.
Yeah, I was glad to hear that. I feel like there's so much in Disney Plus that, I definitely remember catching the show on Disney Channel, but it was probably released closer when I was like maybe ending middle school, starting high school, so it was getting a little more busy, wasn't watching as much Disney Channel. So probably I've seen a handful of episodes, but I would absolutely love to go back and fully revisit based on what you discussed within the book. More of her fun Yzma schemes, because she is one of my top villains as well.
Yeah, and it's a really well done show. Like they definitely were. I think I'm 31. I think we're probably of a similar age. So I think it was on when maybe we were starting to drift away from Disney Channel.
I was hanging on with Hannah Montana maybe a little bit, but I'm not a Wizards of Waverly Place. That's about where I tap out. I will turn it over though to Emily to pick her selection.
So this was tough because I did love Eartha Kitt's chapter. I loved Angela Lansbury. Verna Felton was a great chapter, but I want to talk about Thurl Ravenscroft because I think I learned the most in this chapter, because that's a name that I've heard, but I couldn't always place all of his work and all of the work that he's done with Disney. And I really like this chapter. I think this is a good example from what I was speaking to earlier of how you kind of give us a well-rounded picture of each of these people, that you ground us in Thurl Ravenscroft's voice by reminding listeners, you probably know You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch, or Tony the Tiger. from Frosted Flakes. And as soon as I read those, I knew his voice instantly. And I think that's what's fun about reading this book is once you place the character, you can hear all of the voices as you're reading. So for him, once I had that place, I was just so amazed at how much he was involved in Disney Studio from Pinocchio all the way through the Jungle Book. So he is there the entire animation span of Walt Disney's life. But in roles that I didn't really think of, like all of the singers for Pink Elephants on Parade, his quartet, the Mellow Men, did a lot of singing and vocals. He was in doing Peter Pan, You Can Fly, a bunch of songs in Peter Pan, singing for Dogs at the Pound in Lady and the Tramp, Paul Bunyan. He was the horse captain, the gray horse in 101 Dalmatians, Sir Bart in Sword in the Stone. He's one of the cats in the Aristocats. And it just like keeps going. While I was reading, I was highlighting everyone's parts as I went, just so that I could do a quick reference. And his is my most highlighted chapter of all of the projects he had been involved in for Disney specifically.
Yeah, what's interesting about him too is, and that was pretty much his natural voice. What he had said is people like Hans Conried to voice Captain Hook could do, hundreds of different voices, but, Thurl Ravenscroft just happened to have that unique sort of deep bass voice that fits so well.
Yeah,
and you're right. He's all over the parks.
Yes, I was just actually looking at those highlights in my chapter that it's not just the books, but he did a lot for Disney World and Disneyland. Any Miracles from Molecules fans out there?
It's me. I'm the fan.
This was for Courtney. He sang that song as well, and gave a lot of voice talent to It's a Small World, Mark Twain Riverboat, Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Like, again, the amount of highlighting I had in this chapter for stuff that he was involved in. I picked him because I think this is one that you might have heard his name, but you can't always pinpoint his voice because he's might be singing with other folks. But he's in so much. And once you said, like, You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch, now thinking about Grim Grinning Ghosts and other songs, like, now I hear his voice and know exactly where he is in those attractions and in the films.
Yeah, and actually, so that bust in the Haunted Mansion, it's the only place that you can see his face in a Disney park or anything Disney related. So
I have a fun story about that. I had a math teacher in high school who was super into like trivia and just would love to like throw random trivia off the wall. And I remember he was shook because I knew who Thurl Ravenscroft was. And I credit that to, I had just taken the Keys to the Kingdom tour when I turned 16, because that's how old you have to be to do the tour. And I believe we rode the Haunted Mansion. And I guess our tour guide must have said something about, Thurl Ravenscroft. A lot of people think that bust is Walt Disney. It's not. You might recognize the name Thurl Ravenscroft, much like Emily said, as Tony the Tiger and You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch. I believe my teacher's trivia question was about, it must have been around Christmas time, about like who sang You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch, and also voiced Tony the Tiger. And like my hand shot right up, and he could tell he was surprised anyone knew, and even more surprised when I got it correct and said Thurl Ravenscroft. But I felt very proud of my knowledge, which was directly tied to Disney. I think he was like, how do you even know that? And I had to tell that exact story. I was like, well, it's not even related to the two of those. It's thanks to Walt Disney World.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that comes up because you study Disney that now you know.
Yes, I really liked all of the connections that you made within each of these chapters, mentioning where some of those actors crisscross, because I don't know, I was someone as a kid, maybe before social media of the internet, but still spending a lot of time with the computer. I would read the IMDb trivia section for fun, and it reminded me of like when you're just like, oh yeah, this person starred in this with this other person.
Yeah, it's that and the connections tab.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All of those fun things. Well, I'd love to know, as you were doing some of that research, who was someone that stood out or surprised you the most while writing your book, or even a fun fact that you came across?
I found Verna Felton really interesting because I didn't realize just how many characters she voiced, and what range she had. And if you go through a lot of the radio shows she was on, you can actually hear in a lot of these shows her range as well. So she was somebody who really interested me. Now, in terms of Disney, the one thing I found is that when these films were released, the animated films, each film pretty much stood in the shadow of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which, was their first full-length animated feature. So every, side character was compared to the dwarves, every villain to the evil queen, every princess to Snow White. And that was something that stood out in reviews from that time again and again and again. And one thing that surprised me is I knew that Sleeping Beauty sort of had more like tepid reviews, but I didn't realize that it was sort of almost received with like a shrug. In my chapter on Eleanor Audley, I put in an excerpt of a review where they're sort of like, well, this is all stuff that we've seen before. So it made me get into appreciation actually for Snow White, because they all existed in Snow White's shadow. And then the other thing that stood out too is, you realize just how fragile full-length, hand-drawn animation was. If a lot of these films weren't a success, then it probably would not have continued as an art. That's especially true of 1950s Cinderella. In a lot of ways, that was sort of a last chance to see, okay, can Disney continue, full-length animated features? So it's a little sad, but it also makes you grateful for the features that we do have.
And I think what was cool that with the voices that you focused on, we got some of those films that maybe more modern audiences don't always go back to. I think we do often for Cinderella, maybe Sleeping Beauty, but talking about Lady and the Tramp, Dumbo, some of those more early films, I really liked that they kind of got to be front and center. Particularly if you are a modern audience coming to this book, that maybe you'll be more encouraged to go back and revisit some of these classics, not just Snow White, not just the princess films, but some of the other classics as well.
Yeah, that actually was one of my main goals, is people do go back and revisit, especially, it's true of all of them, but especially the Aristocats and Robin Hood are two that I really think get overlooked. I mean, I love cats, so if it has a cat in it, I'm going to like it. But I love the Aristocats, and I found that as I started to research these films, a lot of people don't, or a lot of times Robin Hood sort of gets written off for using a lot of recycled animation. But, they all have their merits, whether it's music, a charming princess, the cats. So that, was really one of my main goals, is that you do go back and revisit a lot of these features.
My quick aside, thinking about Eva Gabor and her voice, Duchess, when you credited that a lot of people, or the surviving legacy of the Aristocats is really Marie, I had the opportunity for Marie invited me on Main Street a couple years ago to join her and greet guests at Walt Disney World, and that is very true, that a number of guests that came to meet Marie knew who Marie was, but not her film. They didn't know her brothers. They didn't know her mother. And every now and then, though, a gem of a child, one that sticks out to me, she came up and just looked at Marie and I and said, "A rinky tinky tinky." And I was just so happy. She had to be about 5 years old that she knew the movie, because nothing on the merchandise says "a rinky tinky tinky," and that made me really happy. But that's very true, and I'm glad you gave Eva Gabor her chapter.
Yeah, she was a lot of fun. For those not familiar, she was a actress from Hungary who's very, she's almost what we now might consider like a B-list celebrity. But from about the 1940s to 80s, she was all over TV, radio, movies, doing a lot of publicity appearances. And she had a very glamorous European persona. So she's really a perfect fit for Duchess, and then also Miss Bianca in The Rescuers and The Rescuers Down Under. I think the good thing, too, is now with Disney Plus, it's a lot easier to go ahead and give these movies a chance. So if you think, yeah, I watched those cats, years ago, I didn't like it. Well, now you can go back and watch the Aristocats because you have, you've already paid your subscription. It can't hurt to give it a try.
You talked a lot. We've talked about how a lot of these actors work together. You talked about listening to radio. Nicole, Courtney and I love the research process. So we want to know, how many movies, shorts did you watch, radio programs you listened to? Where did you start and find all this information to write about each of these actors?
Yeah, so I started I worked on a person-by-person basis. That's how I started, and then I'll go into what I did later. But so I started with, Peggy Lee. I'll just start by watching Lady and the Tramp a few times, and I went back and watched it. I'm not sure how many times in total. I listened. Peggy Lee is one of my favorite singers, and she wrote the music. She helped write the music for Lady and the Tramp, and she voiced Cyan Am, and Peg, and the mother, in Lady and the Tramp. And so, I would look at, read biographies of her. I'd listen to different radio shows she was on. And as you mentioned before, you start to hear other people as you cross over. I can tell you that one book that I found to be a really crucial resource, if you want to learn more about Disney animation, is The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson, excuse me. And they go through the animation process, what it's like, but they also mention specific characters. And then their other book about villains was also a pretty crucial resource. One thing I found with the research is that it was to find out more about these people and their role with Disney, it was very needle in a haystack type research. So, you've had Didier Guez on before, I believe, and I read through all the Walt's People books. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of a gamble, will a voice actor come up or not? And there was one interview that Bob Thomas, who wrote what's sort of almost considered the official biography of Walt Disney, did. And he was asking one of the animators about his work with Hans Conried and voicing Captain Hook. And the animator was like, yeah, he was great to work with anyway. And then he moved on to other things. Oh, no. And that happened again. And that, I don't know how many dozens or even hundreds of times that happened, where it was like, oh, yeah, they were great anyway. And I'm like, no, just give me a little bit. But when I did find things, it made it sort of all the more special.
I love that process of research when you're like, you do find that key of what you were looking for.
Yeah, so I mean, it was fun, and I learned a massive amount about Disney, but every so often I would get a little frustrated. Because, that was especially true for Eleanor Audley.
Yeah, as you said, she was a little tougher.
So my suspicion with her is she may have been in the category of somebody who went to work and did an excellent job and left. And I looked, I tried to look, I'll give her as an example of some of my research process. So, one of her more prominent roles was as the mother-in-law on My Favorite Husband, which was the radio program that served as the precursor to I Love Lucy. So, I Love Lucy, from Lucille Ball, a lot of these people were on Lucy's program. So I would research the radio shows, the television shows. Does she come up at all? She had a prominent role on the radio show as Lucy's mother-in-law, and nothing came up about her. She also was, she played a lot of sort of high-minded mother-in-laws. She was also Ava Gabor's mother-in-law on Green Acres, which is the television show that Ava Gabor is probably most known for. Again, nothing came up. But I did find little bits, especially from the animators that she worked with. Mark Davis, who was the primary animator for Maleficent, who Eleanor Audley voiced, he especially loved working with her. And Mary Costa, who voiced Sleeping Beauty, Princess Aurora, she also had fond memories of working with Eleanor Audley. So it was really just sifting through and finding what little bits and pieces I could. Another great resource, maybe I'll provide you the link to it. It's the animator Andreas Deja. He voiced especially a lot of villains like Scar and Gaston. He has an excellent blog. And he'll post information about a lot of specific characters. And that's actually where I found a lot of information as well.
Yeah, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. And he actually shared a memory of meeting Eleanor Audley.
Oh, very cool.
And that's one of the reasons why I was able to keep her in, because I figured I had this, more contemporary memory of him meeting her. Actually, one of my favorite finds, if I can share from the book, is,
of course.
So one of the characters that Verna Felton voiced was Flora, the Red Fairy in Sleeping Beauty. So she was very professional. She was well liked, but she was having a little bit of difficulty reading her lines. And Andreas Deja heard a recording session where she was like, I can't read this line. Who on earth wrote this? So I just picture all these animators being a little intimidated by her.
Oh, I bet. I would love to hone in on the radio part of your research because that felt so unique to me. I mean, certainly we all love going through the treasure trove that is Disney Plus, as you said, or even our home video collections. But as you've said, we're around a certain age, and I feel like we didn't grow up with the radio that you're talking about. Certainly I listen to the radio as I'm driving in my car, but not these serialized programs, which, as you said, were the precursor to television. So how did you go about finding these programs, exploring them? Is there like a great archive that you'd love to point us to? Because I can see Emily and I just going down that rabbit hole for fun.
Yeah, that's a really fun rabbit hole. I mean, for listeners who aren't aware, I mean, radio was a massive form of entertainment from about the mid 20s to the mid 50s, and then it began to fade due to television in the mid 50s. So, I mean, any kind of television show that we have today was on radio. So mystery, news, sports, comedy. So the main way I really just had to, there's a website called oldtimeradiodownloads.com, and they would list a lot of the actors and episodes of shows they were on. So I really just got started listening and finding shows that I thought modern listeners might appreciate the most. There's a show I mentioned a few times called Suspense. And it's very much, each episode is very different, but it's sort of usually ordinary people who are caught up in a murder of some kind or some kind of suspenseful tale. And if you use your imagination, a lot of them are really fantastic to listen to today. And they give you a really great look into life in the past and a lot of things that we have forgotten about. You know, a lot of stories feature where hitchhiking is a plot device, which from the 30s to about the late 60s, you know, hitchhiking was quite a common way to get around. So there's a lot of aspects of life that I think add a lot of depth if you want to understand history. It gives you a better appreciation of what a lot of gender dynamics were like at the time, which I think we sort of aware of, you know, the role that smoking played in people's lives. It's a lot of little things like that that I think just add another layer to your understanding of the past.
That's a great perspective on it. I feel like a good recommendation, I'm sure, as our listeners of podcasts who enjoy podcasts, it sounds like a great resource for, maybe when there's some downtime in your podcast feed, you've consumed everything and you're to listen to, just pop on over to those radio shows.
Yeah, and I'll share at the end, of course, but I have a Facebook page where I'll post some episodes.
Oh, great.
That are a really great, example of the genre. I think they still hold up pretty well. Especially some comedy doesn't age very well. Yeah.
I think NPR also plays some old radio programs on like Sundays, because I remember driving in my car. I usually listen to NPR in the morning on my way to work. And so that's my preset. And I got in the car on the weekend and it was late in the evening and it was radio programs, including commercials. And the commercials were actually my favorite part. Hearing how people would market, what products people were interested in buying. But it's always, I found that so interesting to listen to that on the radio in my car.
Yeah, and the 30s are a little tricky, but a lot of radio from the 40s and 50s survives, and you can easily find it on different websites and YouTube. So it's definitely available. And a lot of it's still a great listen. At the time, I work in Center City, Philadelphia, so a lot of the times I was listening to it walking to or while I was on the train. Which I mentioned in the book because some of the episodes actually are quite creepy, especially that show Suspense. And reading through the book, I totally forgotten this era when I would walk to the train into the city. But it makes great listening. Most of the episodes are about a half hour long. And it is funny to hear, especially some of the products that would sponsor shows like spark plugs. And it's a lot of cigarettes as well. But yeah, it's a really interesting world that I sort of knew existed and I kind of listened to, but not, I didn't realize just how much I would enjoy it. And that was probably the nicest treat.
We have a tough question.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite voice actor? Like even thinking about that list of 40 that you started with before you chose who you're going to put in this book, do you have a favorite voice actor?
See, that's tough because I kind of want to answer Eleanor Audley, but I had a lot of trouble finding shows where she had a prominent role. But if I had to answer, I'd probably say Peggy Lee is my favorite singer, and that was true before I started writing the book. But there were quite a few other favorites that I kind of wanted to add, and I just didn't feel I had the room. So I can share one if you like.
Sure. Little bonus content.
Another favorite, was Lucille Laverne, who voiced the evil queen and the old hag in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Uh-huh.
So she's actually someone I continue to research, but I felt I had so much, I just wanted to kind of keep going with her because, she's really the first character to speak in a full-length animated Disney feature. And she had a whole fascinating life going back even into the 1880s, working in show business and working in silent film.
And what a fascinating voice range, too. Like, when you said the evil queen and the old hag, those voices are very different. So that's incredible talent. Many of these voice actors you included, that incredible talent of being able to change your voice to sound and fit different characters.
And she did the old hag by taking her teeth out.
Oh my gosh. That's wild.
Yeah, because the animators thought she had some kind of strategy, and she's like, no, I just took out my teeth.
Simplicity is best sometimes.
And thank you for sharing that extra bonus, like a little special chapter in our episode here. I have an additional question that I'd love to know based on your recent trip to Walt Disney World. How did writing this book change your perspective of the parks? Like, were you more attuned to little nuances or found any hidden gems related to your research?
I did ride the Haunted Mansion a few extra times.
Nice.
I love the Haunted Mansion anyway, but, I took a few extra rides on it since it's in a few chapters in the book. And it did make me think more about, I wonder who this announcer is, and even when I watch the movies now, it's like, I wonder who voiced that character or that animal, or, I wonder if I'm listening to a radio show, I wonder if this person has a Disney connection. So it's really a rabbit hole that you go down. So it was definitely a lot of fun. It was a different person, especially because there were Ravenscroft voices on so many attractions. Now the voice, they may have used a different voice actor over time, but, his voice could be heard in Splash Mountain. So that was a lot of fun, too, thinking all these places as voices. But then I even thought, like, I'm on Living with the Land. I'm like, I wonder who this announcer is. And, and there were a lot of things like that. It's just more questions.
I do know that the announcer for Living with the Land currently is the same as the People Mover. I think I had heard that on another podcast. So I don't believe they've done any Disney movies, but those two are the same person.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'll look up the name after and message it to you in our little email thread. But I think Lou Mongello of WDW Radio had interviewed him on several episodes back, but that'll be my own research deep dive to find that episode for you.
Yeah. Yes, that happened again. I'm like, I wonder who did this voice, and the Carousel of Progress, who did those voices.
And I think you bring up a point that's what I took away from your book overall, is not just learning about individuals, but the appreciation that often when we think of the animated feature, we go to the art and the music, but not always necessarily thinking about the individual people who actually lent those voices. And I think now with social media, we're starting to get more into that. Like when Raya and the Last Dragon, they had all these voices of Disney coming together to welcome her into the animation family, but that wasn't always, we didn't have that for these earlier classics. And I think thinking about those people gets lost. We focus so much on the animators and the artwork, the music, that we forget about the voices sometimes.
Right. And I think research is becoming a lot easier, especially with the internet, and that helps. Newspapers.com was another crucial resource. So, when talking about Hans Conried, a lot of his quotes came from some interviews he did when he was doing lecture tours in rural areas. So on that website, newspapers.com, I can find it, but probably even 20 years ago, it probably wouldn't have been available to me to see. So I think there's definitely more and more opportunity, or to talk to people who live across the country. A lot of the Walt's people interviews, it seems like the people interviewing them had to go to California or where the person lived to talk to them to get the interview. And now we can use Skype.
So we have 2 more tough questions for you.
Okay.
We always ask these of our authors. What is your favorite Disney book?
Well, that's a tough question. The Jason Sorrell book about the Haunted Mansion is one of my absolute favorite books. And then my other favorite book is Disney War by James B. Stewart. It's a really interesting look into Disney history during the time that we were growing up.
Disney War gets mentioned a lot. I feel like Emily and I will have to do the toe up into that someday, but it's so long. Maybe a multi-part series.
Yeah, and it's really thorough. I'm not sure how many. I think I've read half a dozen times, and you always find whole new chapter, whole new things in it that you didn't really realize before. Whereas you learn more about Disney, I think you pick up on little cues that you didn't before. So it's really interesting to think about all that was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're glad for those suggestions because, of course, we're always adding to our bookshelves here. But for anyone who might want to contribute their own book to the lexicon, we'd love to ask, finally, what advice do you have for others who aspire to write a book one day?
Well, actually, I have a quote in addition to my quote at the end. So this is a quote from Walt Disney that he said when they were working on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And they were having challenges animating the forest scene as Snow White flees. So he said, you can't tell until you try something. And that's what I found with the book. I was I'm not sure if I can do this. I'm not sure if it was you don't know until you get started. So sometimes with the goal, you just have to try.
I like that.
And do your best.
We got a bonus quote. Thank you so much for that.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. It's just so simple and straightforward. It's the truth. You just have to try. I did set aside time, and I tried to have a general outline that got a lot more flexible over time. So I sort of mentioned before how I would go through person by person, but, maybe I'm done Peggy Lee, but then I find something else about Lady and the Tramp that I include in her chapter. So a good example would be that I learned that, a lot of the design of the street in Lady and the Tramp and Main Street in Disneyland were going on simultaneously. So I would go back, and that going back and forth went on. But yeah, I definitely set aside time, especially Sundays.
Okay, very cool.
That was a big work day.
Good to have a dedicated time for it. When you said outlining, I thought back to college with Emily because as writing instructors together, we were teaching assistants. We are a big fan of outlining everything, which is also why we outline where we're heading next with our shows. So next month, we are having a Gal Pal podcast party in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Princess Diaries live-action film. We will read the first book in the series by Meg Cabot. 20 years ago, Anne Hathaway made her royal debut to the silver screen as Mia Thermopolis, starring alongside Julie Andrews. The Princess Diaries has everything we loved about a 2000s film: butterfly clips, scooters, a rom-com makeover montage, and while we hold a special place in our hearts for this 2001 film, it actually has its roots in a 17-book series, but don't worry, you do not have to read all 17 books by next month, just The Princess Diaries Volume 1, which the movie is primarily based on. We and our gal pals will discuss the book and film and hope that you will join us then. In the meantime, you can keep up with Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse, and email us with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. Please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others can find our podcast and read and listen along with us. You can keep up with me, Courtney, on Instagram at GreatGuthsby and on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter at the same handle at Emily_McD. And Spencer, where can our listeners keep up with you, and where's the best place for us to buy your book?
So you can find me on Facebook at Spencer Wright Author, and on Instagram at Overlooked Diz. And then the best place to currently buy my book is on Amazon.com.
Fantastic. And you already gave us one quote, but would you mind closing us out and sharing your other quote with us, please?
Yes, so this is a 1981 quote from Betty Davis, the actress, and she found that, the movie industry was facing tough times. She felt the optimism of the past was fading. So she said a quote that I think is still relevant today. She says, "Who says I can't read or watch what I want or dream outside of their narrow boundaries? Dreams are at a premium today, and I'm fully behind the dreamers."
Oh, well, we're so glad that you dreamed up this book and came along to share it with us today. Thank you again.
Yep, thank you.
Just keep on reading, everybody.
The Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.